everyone, my name is Dani Gelardi. I'm a senior soil scientist at the Washington State Department of Agriculture. I had hoped to be there live with you all today, but actually, as you listen to this, I am taking soil samples in berry fields in Skagit County, but I do hope to be there for the Q&A. Thanks so much for being here and for bearing with this recording. I'm super excited to talk to you all today about soil carbon in policy and practice and some of what we're working on at the Washington State Department of Agriculture and at the Washington Soil Health Initiative. So to kick us off today, we will start by just touching on why soils are so important. No one in this room really needs to be reminded or told, so we'll breeze past that pretty quickly and move on to why, even though soil carbon is so important, it can be so difficult to increase in agricultural soils. We'll touch on the common barriers of science, information, and economics. And then we'll talk about potential ways to move past these barriers through some overarching principles that we use when designing programs and policies, specifically in the Washington Soil Health Initiative, but hopefully throughout our efforts in the soil carbon space. So again, we know that soils are an important part of climate change mitigation. They are an enormous terrestrial carbon sink, something like 4 times the size of the carbon that's stored in the atmosphere, and 4 times or more the carbon that is stored in all of the plant biomass combined. This is an enormous and incredibly important store of carbon. And of course, we don't want to release any more of this carbon into the atmosphere. And in fact, what we'd like to do is begin to pull some of that carbon out of the atmosphere back into the soils. And because it's so important, you've likely heard quite a lot of buzz in the media about soil as a natural climate solution. We are currently experiencing historic levels of funding and interest for soil protection and particularly soil carbon sequestration. And like I mentioned before, just because it's so important doesn't mean it's so easy. And in fact, the 3 most common barriers to being able to increase soil carbon can really be distilled down into scientific barriers, information barriers, and economics. So I want to start by just really touching briefly on soil carbon sequestration science. This is a brief primer, and I'm sure there are folks in the room who know that I'm oversimplifying this, but for the sake of a very brief talk, we know that soils come in through the, carbon comes in through the atmosphere through plants. It is then put into the soil in the form of plant residues, in the form of roots and root exudates, and then through a series of microbial processes, that carbon is stored in different pools, which hopefully make it all the way to mineral-associated organic matter. This is the carbon that is protected by adhering to soil minerals and could potentially be stored in the soils for really long periods of time. But it's also important to note that that same process that brings carbon all the way to being adhered to soil minerals can also be reversed through desorption and microbial consumption and carbon loss through microbial respiration. It's really sort of a cycle that often gets oversimplified when we talk about soil carbon sequestration. It's important to remember that soil microbes both store and utilize soil organic matter. And this isn't a bad thing. In fact, we need soil microbes to use organic matter to power a broad range of ecosystem services. So you can really think of that carbon that comes into the soil entering into something like a soil microbial factory. And that factory both produces and uses soil carbon like a battery. And what that battery powers is a whole range of really important things like nutrient cycling and availability, food production, soil structure, which of course leads to erosion prevention, and pest and disease resistance. So it's always important when we're talking about regenerative agriculture or increasing soil organic matter that we recognize that agriculture inherently and necessarily exploits soil carbon. And there's also just a lot of challenges to measuring soil carbon. So we know that soils are incredibly heterogeneous. Even within a single field, the potential to store carbon varies pretty dramatically. Soils vary by depth. Soil carbon varies by season, and it changes. Just because you put soil carbon or carbon through crop residues into the soil, for example, doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to make it all the way to that mineral adhered soil organic carbon. It's also really hard to measure. Remember that I showed multiple pools that the carbon moves through along this microbial processing. And this figure here shows some of those different pools. You may be familiar with all of the different carbon measurements, MINC, POXY, TOC, SOM. Each of these costs money, and each of these takes a long time to measure. And sometimes when we measure them, we're really only measuring them in the soil surface or just one sample per field. So it can be very difficult to really get at how much carbon is in the soil and to estimate how much carbon could be stored in that soil. It's not an infinite process by which management can just increase soil organic matter forever. In fact, most soils will have a sort of natural equilibrium after which gains in soil carbon plateau as a result of management. And again, soil carbon is not permanent, so it can be reversed through very natural processes like microbial consumption and utilization of that carbon, but also through things like tillage and different aspects of cropping systems. So even if somehow we could guarantee the exact measurement of soil carbon that is in your agricultural soils, the truth of the matter is we don't know necessarily what the impact of that management is. And that's because management is really context dependent. You're all likely familiar with the principles of soil health management, and these can provide a lot of ecosystem services. Again, erosion prevention, increased water storage and water filtration, things like cleaner air and cleaner water. There's a lot of benefits to some of these practices, but we have to be really careful when we use them to promise gains in soil carbon. They may or may not lead to increased soil carbon based on a whole range of variables. So just because cover cropping dramatically improved soil carbon in a field in Kansas doesn't necessarily mean it's going to in Douglas County, for example. And now we are getting to the economics. It can be really challenging to recommend to growers to implement all these soil health management practices because of the societal benefits to those practices when it would be the farmer that bears the cost. So I want to show some really brief data from a survey that we issued in 2022 on the motivations and barriers to different conservation practices. And what we found was that the majority of folks, 97 respondents, the majority of those respondents were reducing or using reduced or no-till. Of the 28% who are conventionally tilling, overwhelmingly they cited costs as one of the biggest barrier. And even the farms that are reducing tillage, 79% of those cited costs as a continual challenge. And when we asked folks what they had to purchase to switch to reduced or no tillage, these were the four most commonly cited pieces of equipment. So almost half of all respondents said they had to purchase a higher horsepower tractor, additional drills, mower, and a self-propelled sprayer. And if you start to add up those costs, you can see that we get well over $1 million per farm to reduce tillage. And that doesn't even include all the other soil health management practices of integrating livestock, cover cropping, altering stubble management, etc. But it's not just economics that can be a barrier to implementing these things, of course. There's also a lack of resources available for specific regions and specific cropping systems on how to implement some of these things. And I know this room is a particularly progressive group of growers and technical assistance providers and researchers. And so it's great that there's this peer-to-peer network, but a lot of folks don't necessarily have access to either their neighbors or to an extension office to help them learn about how to implement these practices. An example is that nationally, we saw as of 2021 that there has been more money distributed through NRCS for cover crops than ever before. though nationally, cover crop adoption is still only at 5.1%. And so it feels a little confusing if there's so much money available for this. Why is adoption so low? And when we asked those same wheat producers in our survey in 2022, what we found was 97% of Washington wheat producers do not cover crop. And of the 3% who do, all of them cited that they do receive incentive payments. They did not have to purchase new equipment. And nevertheless, just finding out how to do it was a bigger barrier. So knowing when to terminate, what species mix, how to integrate it into insurance cycles and cash crop cycles was a big challenge for folks and one of the biggest barriers to cover cropping. So we've talked about why it's hard to adopt soil conservation practices, and we've talked about some of the major barriers. So let's talk about what people are doing to overcome these barriers. What policies and programs exist, and how can they help? So I don't have a ton of time to go over all of this today, though I will say some of us have a manuscript under review right now, and hopefully this work will be published soon and I can distribute it. But essentially in the United States, there are 10 major ways to promote soil carbon sequestration and soil conservation. Incentive payments, which folks are perhaps most familiar with, things like NRCS EQIP, carbon markets, which is a particularly controversial form of promoting soil carbon research. At the Washington Soil Health Initiative, we have long-term agroecological research sites. Specifically at the Lind Research Station, we will be looking at the impacts of integrating livestock and cover crops into a wheat cropping cycle. There are models, there's technical assistance, things like resources and webinars and on-farm demonstrations from folks like Extension or your peers or conservation district offices, certification programs, things like Salmon Safe or Farmed Smart, financial reform. There's a lot of effort to look at using crop insurance premium reductions to incentivize conservation or to provide tax breaks for folks trying to purchase some of that very expensive equipment that's necessary. Public outreach, and of course, regulation, which fortunately is not really too much a player in the soil carbon space, though in some cases it is for soil nitrogen. So in order for any of these strategies to be successful, they really need to provide a whole host of benefits. They need to support practice adoption, drive innovation, not overburden producers, reward early adopters, generate economic valuation for these practices. We want near-term results, long-term results. We want to promote co-benefits and sort of take away the focus of carbon and this kind of mania for carbon, especially when all of these practices may not increase carbon in all contexts. We want to minimize externalities, whether that be environmental externalities or social externalities. And, one potential benefit is obligating action. And when we took a look at all of these strategies, what we found was that there was really no one way to hit all of those benefits. And in fact, an integrated approach is required to, for example, reward early adopters, but also incentivize change in business as usual farmers. So really what we found through analysis is that a lot of different strategies are necessary and a lot of different stakeholders are necessary to carry out those strategies. For an effective and science-informed policy portfolio to really look at increasing soil carbon and soil organic matter, we need the help of researchers, public interest groups, government, consumers, industry, and of course, growers. And so I, again, don't have too much time to go over some of these guiding principles, but I just want to touch on a few things while I have the soapbox here. Natural climate solutions, agricultural soils, they are only part of the solution. We cannot look at increasing soil carbon as a way to reduce pressure on just reducing greenhouse gas emissions from other sectors. So it's always important to remember when we're talking about natural climate solutions that it is just a one part of the larger picture. We also want to promote adaptation, co-benefits. and mitigation, which is carbon. It is not enough to talk about payments for soil carbon. For a lot of people, that's not particularly motivating, but what may be motivating is all of the other benefits for air and water quality, for erosion prevention, and ideally for disease resistance and suppression and improved yields, although there's a lot of questions there too. We need to address the barriers to adoption. It's not enough to provide a check and say, hey, cover crop, when we also may not know how to cover crop in a certain area or know whether or not those cover crops will lead to the desired outcomes. So it's important to look at research both into the scientific and social aspects of practice adoption. We always want to make sure our policies are regional and very specific to a cropping system and a farming community. We want to beware of carbon trading. This is a soapbox I could get on for a while, but I'll keep it short. Soil carbon being as heterogeneous and dynamic as it is, does not easily lend itself to contractual obligations that may be pushed through things like regulation or carbon markets. We want to minimize externalities. We want to engage diverse stakeholders. And perhaps most importantly, we don't want to give up. I never want to present all of the barriers to soil carbon sequestration as a way to discourage people, because we know soils are the literal and metaphorical platform on which society is built, and their protection is incredibly, incredibly important, even though it's not necessarily always easy. I don't have time to talk too much about the Washington Soil Health Initiative, but of course those guiding principles inform all of the work that we do. We have a lot of different programs, which many of you have probably participated in and have helped inform. So thank you for your work. And with that, I leave my contact information, and hopefully my connection out here in these berry fields is good enough for me to answer questions. Thanks so much.